All right, in the basement today, I want to do a follow-up on this Hansu Power Rack. I've owned a couple of them so far, and I think that this is a really great deal. It has a little bit of improvement over the last rack that I reviewed from them. I'll link that in the description box below. I had some call-outs where I thought it could be improved, and generally speaking, they at least attempted a lot of it. So this isn't going to be a full in-depth review. If you want, check out that original video linked in the description box below. But I really think far and away, this is the best power rack for the money that you can get. Up until last week, this was IPF approved, and funny enough, in my comments on my original video, I was like, I wish they would get rid of all the IPF branding because I don't think it's necessary. And now it's really not necessary. So a little bit of a foreshadowing here. This one does not have IPF branding on it, and as of today, April 13th or 12th, I don't know, it's not on the IPF approved list. So we'll see if that gets changed, but it's still used at high level meets in like the USAPL and some of their other affiliates across the world. And you really can't get a better combo rack for the price because as of right now, and at least for the end of this month, which we'll talk about hopefully in this video, this thing is listed for $1,500 with free shipping. That's marked down from like over $3,000. You can use my code BASEMENT to knock some money off. It brings it down to $1,350 with free shipping. And if you recall from my initial video, one of the reasons I like this so much is because it is a heavy duty rack. It's super heavy. In fact, I really compare it to the weight and robustness of like the Go Strong, which is now produced by Rogue, or even the Rogue Combo Rack, which are notorious for being some very heavy racks. And in some cases for meet purposes, hard to move around, but I think for a home gym purpose, it's fantastic. And again, this is what you might see sometimes on the platform where a lot of the other budget combos you would not. So for $1,350, free shipping for a good rack, which up until recently was IPF approved, it is a really hard thing to pass up on. Now, that being said, it is not perfect by any means. And the first thing I want to call out is even though I like a lot of Hansu equipment, their bars, their plates, their combos, some of their other equipment that they sell like knee sleeves, things like that, which by the way have also been revoked from IPF approval. The company is by no means perfect. And this is one of the things I really want to get clear. Although I'm a big fan of what they do in terms of what they produce, I am not always a big fan of how they go about it. There was a long stretch of time where they were not fulfilling orders. Their customer service has always been lacking in my opinion, and they left a lot of people hanging with cancel orders and not fulfilling orders and no communication about it or refunds about it. I do think that they've gotten their act together, mostly, meaning that it seems like they're shipping again. They've relaunched their website. They seem to be doing okay, but their communication is still really bad, meaning that I've known people that have ordered this particular rack on this particular deal, and I don't get any kind of heads up that it's shipped, and then just one day it shows up at their house. So for something this big and this large that comes via freight, it is obviously something that ideally you would have communication with because it's not just something that they leave on your doorstep like Amazon. So I do wish that they'd improve that a lot. And speaking of communication, while we're on that subject, I have told Hansu personally that I don't really think that their business practices in terms of communicating sales and pricing is super efficient, meaning that like they ran a special that was like, hey, for the next 7 people that order, you're going to get a very special price on this combo, which was true. And some of my friends ordered and they used my code, which I really appreciate. But then like 2 weeks later, they dropped the price even further. And the price on this, where like, is a sale? Is it not on sale? It always seems to be all over the place. It's just kind of frustrating, I think, from a consumer standpoint when you buy something because you think you're getting a good deal, only to find out that there's a better deal and your equipment might not have shipped, or you weren't told that it is shipped yet. And there's no really way to contact anyone to get that resolved. So I want to get that off my chest because again, even though I'm very high on this rack, I'm very high on a lot of the equipment that they put out, I will say it comes at the cost of very poor to bad customer service. So just be prepared if you order from them. It's frustrating, it's infuriating, but at the end of the day, if you get what you pay for, what you should, it is oftentimes well worth the price. So let's talk about this particular combo. I've had it for a couple of weeks now. I mostly use this for benching. And the reason I wanted to get it was to replace my setup bench that I had before, which was great, but I wanted the possibility of squatting in a combo just to get very comp specific. And I really like this rack. Better colors than the previous one I had, which was like a gray off-white. So the first thing I will say is the colors on this is much better. Just the black and the silver. I think this will match anything because typically black is an accent color for no matter what color rack or equipment you choose to get. So it fits in okay in that regard. I also mentioned they took off the IPF branding, which I really like because I just thought it was a little bit overdone. You don't need to have it on there necessarily, and it tended to work out as I alluded to earlier in this video. So let's kind of speak about some of the main things again, maybe some of the things that haven't changed if you didn't watch my original video. I mentioned the robustness. Part of that is the actual frame of this rack is pretty deep, which I like because as a squatter, I tend to set up where I push into my power rack. And oftentimes I've found that when I go to a competition, because the racks aren't secured down or they're a lot lighter duty because they're meant to be broken down, moved around, adjusted, pushing into the rack oftentimes makes them tip. This one can still do it if you have enough weight on it, but I haven't found that I needed to bolt this down or have like a block up front, which a lot of people do. This one does come with what I would consider like a little bit of a resistance frame on top of it. So it helps with pushing, and although it will move around some if you're moving heavy weights and slamming into this and this isn't set up like against a wall or something to brace it on, it's very easy still to move around because I just picked it up and moved it over here for the sake of this video. And if you have a helping hand, that'll obviously make it much, much easier. So the frame on this is very good. One of the things I talked about in my first video that was frustrating about this was putting it together because it had a couple of different bolt sizes. I made the comment like if you're in a meet situation or a meet director and you're using this for a rack where you're transporting it, putting it together takes longer because you have to have different bolt sizes and pieces of equipment in order to put it together. It's not very time friendly. They have switched that. So they've taken that advice, and for the frame and almost everything on here, it uses the same bolt throughout, which is really helpful. It's really convenient. The only difference there is on the bottom of the bench to secure the bench pad itself to the frame. It uses a little bit smaller bolts, but you're probably never going to take the actual bench pad off. Speaking of bench pad, that was one of the areas of improvement. I also called out that the material wasn't just the best. It was more of that like fake pleathery type material. I found that it wasn't very sticky. They've updated to what I would consider more of a sticky pad. This pad itself is also super, super firm, which personally I tend to like a little bit because I find like a softer pad is easier to sink into and brace and kind of dig into. And in a competition standing, you don't know what you're going to get. So a hard pad is, in my opinion, a little bit more difficult. So I like training with that, and I think this is an improvement overall. You also get some Hansu branding on the pad itself, which I think is a little bit nice. Now, speaking of branding, they do have some branding throughout the course of this bench. A lot of it's in the same places. So like underneath the bench itself, you have a couple of the frame options on there. One thing I will note, which I noted in my actual first impressions video, is there's two little tabs where you could potentially hang some other custom branding of your own. In fact, I went back and looked at some of my conversations with the owner, or what I was believed to be the owner of Hansu at the time, as he was telling me about the rack that was coming out and the changes that they were making. They actually had mock-up pictures with the actual arch included, which I forgot about. So maybe if I'm smart in editing, I will show you a quick picture of what that looks like. Not the most ideal bench arch necessarily, where it's like customized and welded in, but I like it from the standpoint of like, if you buy this and you want to go ahead and do your due diligence, you can go out and get someone to make something for you, and you can really make this rack your own, which I am a big fan of. You also have some Hansu logos in the bottom corners here, and I'll kind of show you some of that in B-roll as well. Not really overly obtrusive, because again, it kind of blends into the rack really well. And for the most part, outside of those things and the things on the bench, you don't really have a lot of overall branding, which again, I'm a fan of. This thing looks pretty sleek. And again, it should match kind of a lot of stuff that you would have in your gym already, being black as an accent color. Coming here, a couple of changes with the uprights themselves. So a couple of things is they made these uprights longer. So the inside uprights here, so you have more adjustability standpoints. Not something I called out initially, but something they added, which I think is good. It doesn't hurt anything, but it adds to it. So I do like that aspect as well. They did take my recommendation of taking the laser etching numbers off of the side of the uprights and put those on the rear itself. Where this is really helpful is when you're actually spotting and loading and adjusting these lever arms, you don't have to tilt around and look in. You see exactly where the pin should be. Speaking of the pins themselves as well, they are now shorter, so they do not stick out as much here. They are still pretty big in terms of this regard, but they will not hit your plates as much. Very low likelihood of it happening, but it could still happen on occasion, depending on if the bar is fully shifted over, but they're not as obnoxiously long as they were in the past. Speaking of obnoxiously long, the lever arms, some people had a problem with being very long. They have shortened these up. So in the past, if you looked at some of the videos that I had, the lever arms in this same position were like up here. So they chopped a good amount off, which I never really had a problem with, but if you're really space conscious or not wanting to deal with the really long and obnoxious lever arms, then it's shorter for your benefit there. Also, speaking of shorter, or in this case, a little bit less wide, they brought the uprights in slightly too by about an inch. So these are a little bit over 47 inches wide, which I like, again, because it means less kind of hitting the plates on unracking depending on where the bar is. So all good improvements in that regard. Speaking of the pins too, one of the things they add was a little recession here to the upright so the pins really sit in well. Doesn't really add anything, but I think it is a nice touch. And now when I use other combos, that's one of the things that I kind of look to see if they have or not, because I do think it's helpful because it keeps these seated just a little bit better. Now, other things I want to talk about in this particular video on this particular rack, I mentioned the uprights. One of the other things that I called out on my initial video, let me just sit down and take a little rest. I talked about the actual bolts being the similar size, which I like. I talked about in the old video how some of the hand tightening things for the uprights or for some of the pieces that are removed, to put the uprights in or take the face savers off, they use these really big silver metallic knobs that I didn't really like the way they looked. I thought they looked kind of cheesy. They changed them, but I don't think it's necessarily for the better. They're more utilitarian looking, but they take a lot of time and effort to screw and unscrew. And that's one of the downsides of this rack that I want to call out, is the fact that if you're using this like in a meet situation, which some people will and have done, I don't think it's the most convenient rack in terms of adjustability, because unscrewing things, retightening them, it just takes a long time. I'd like to see some stuff that's more like quick release, pop pin type related, because I think that would go a long way. And those knobs actually transfer over to the bench as well. So I usually leave the bench knobs off just because I'm the only one here training. And for the most part, the bench is heavy enough, the rack is heavy enough where I don't get a lot of movement while in use for bench setup. But it is annoying to take them off, make sure everything is lined up, kind of like I talked about in the first video, and then use those hand screws in order to tighten them. Just not necessary in my opinion. Speaking of other downsides with this rack that I'm not a huge fan of is the actual foot plates here. They're nice, they're big. I think they're actually bigger than the previous versions, at least in the width of each one. But the problem is they're very long, and their position is when you're moving the bench in and out, you can't get a very good tilt up on the bench. You have to keep it relatively low, which for a taller person like myself is kind of a pain in the ass, because if I put it in the ideal position, the actual foot plates would hit the ground and the wheels would be rendered useless. So I'd like to see them either change the position of the foot plates or maybe shorten them up on the back a little bit, just for a little bit of ease of use. Speaking of the bench itself, one of the biggest complaints I had that carried over to one of the light duty racks that they had, which Tanner from Massenomics did a review on, so I'll try to link that as well, because it's a little bit different version of this rack, but it has kind of some of the things that my first rack had and some of the things that this rack had, so it's kind of a little bit of a hybrid. It's a lighter duty rack. But one of the things that we all noted is the bench is still pushed pretty far back. So it's a little bit too deep in my opinion. Now on this version, compared to my old version, they did update it and move it forward by about 4 centimeters, but 4 centimeters is like this much. And I think we can all agree this much is not very much. Now, it doesn't come into play a lot for me necessarily because I don't set up with my feet on the bench anymore, but I do find it to be a problem when I'm doing things like Larson presses or feet up bench, where I actually have to put my feet up, and where I position myself in order to bench with this is a little bit further on the pad, because again, it's way too deep for me, is that my feet have a really hard time getting on the bench. I can really only get my heels on. And in order to get like a normal foot setup, like I would on other combos, I find I'm way, way, way far back on this bench. So I would like to see that ideally come forward a little bit, which could also play into the position of the foot plates, like I mentioned before, because if you set up on this bench where you should, based off of where the head pad is, you will be getting teabagged significantly still, because that 4 centimeter difference isn't really a huge difference in my opinion. Some other things I want to talk about. I mentioned the black paint on here. I think the black looks a lot better. I will say quality-wise, I don't think the paint job, at least on my copy, is as good. I noted in my initial impressions video, there's a couple bits of scuffing and even a little bit of rust on the uprights here and there. And I've continued to see a little bit of paint chipping, which it shouldn't be, because nothing's really touching that. I haven't moved any of this stuff necessarily, and I've heard from some other people who have ordered this rack that things came a little beat up even though they were packed extremely well. So that just leads me to believe that the paint quality isn't as great. Some things that are also missing this rack that were on my first rack is the places where they have like this UHMW or, the heavy duty plastic that they use for alternatives, they used to have it on these angled parts of the face savers, which I liked. They took that off. I don't know why, but they did remove that as well. But otherwise, the frame itself is almost identical, albeit they removed all the holes as they previously had, which didn't really serve a purpose anyways, and probably cost money to actually drill holes into. So it's all like, I don't want to say solid tubing, but there's no holes in the actual tubing used here previously. The only other thing I can think I want to call out is they did change the lips on both the cups here. So the top cups and the bottom cups, or the catches, whatever you want to call them, they angled them out slightly. They tell me this is for an easier unrack. Personally, I don't think it adds anything, but it makes it harder to, like, I had a 3D printed cap that I had made. It doesn't make it as easy to put one of those on. You could still use UHMW tape. I haven't done it in this particular rack. Instead, what I've been using is one of my many barbells that I have that I don't really love. It's like a beater. I would consider a beater power bar that someone sent me that I'm not going to end up keeping, but I don't mind that if I end up grinding some of the knurl off in those particular spaces. So that is the Hansu Power Rack. I think this is called the 2.0, and even though there are some downsides to it, I think overall they made improvements to the first rack, but the biggest improvement is probably the current price point of, like I said, with code, $13.50. It's like, you can't even get like the budget-friendly racks for that little, and this thing is like twice the weight, actually used in competitions, and for the most part is really nice compared to some of the other options that are of similar build quality that are going to end up costing you at least twice as much. So like the Rogue is going to cost you $3,500. The Texas Strength Systems, if you get face savers, it's like $3,700. If you look at Eleiko, if you look at Ghost, look at ER racks, and those ones that you actually find on the platform for the most part, they're going to cost you at least double what this one costs. So even though the trade-off is some questionable finishes or changes that they decided to make, and the very bad customer service, I can't hammer that home apart enough, it's still a great rack for the price, and I am glad to have it, and I don't think you would be disappointed at the price point. So let me know what you think in the comment section below. In the meantime, as always, thanks for watching, and stay big.